Okay, today we're going to learn Eruvin Daf Tevav, which also another famous, we have a lot of famous dapim here. This is one of the famous machlokot between Abaye and Rava. Today's daf is sponsored by Alicia Gordon in honor of his mother, Shifra Vega, for her hospitality and chizuk, learning the daf alongside him during Corona. Okay, we're going to start. I understood he's starting Shana Bet right now, so good luck with your year of learning, Alicia. Okay, we're now going to start from the very top of the page. Itmar. Itmar, again, is usually an introduction to a machloka between two Amoraim. So, lechi ha'omed me'elav, Abaye amar have lechi, Rav amar lo have lechi. If you have a lechi that's standing there, meaning you didn't put it up to be a post in order to show everybody that this is a barrier. Remember, we had a debate. Is lechi because of mechitza? Is it because it's something noticeable? Either which way, we're going to say, how do we deal with something that we didn't put up specifically to be there? So now, Abaye says that still counts as a lechi. Rava says it doesn't count as a lechi. Now, why is this famous? It's famous because there's 6 cases. Generally, we hold like Rava over Abaye. And the reason is, it's kind of like we talked about Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai. The Beit Hillel were more of the zealot approach and more stringent generally. With Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, so Beit Shammai were more stringent. Same with Abaye and Rava. Abaye, we talked about, didn't have a very easy life. And as a result of that, he didn't think halacha always needed to be harmonious and easy and simple. And because of that, his approach is generally more stringent. And because of that, again, I don't know if that's the reason, but it's possible that there's a connection there. In any case, he's generally more stringent. We generally don't hold like him, except for 6 cases. And the abbreviation for it is Ye'al Kigam, Yud Ayin Lamed, Kuf Gimel Mem. I'm not going to get into all 6 cases. Over time, we'll see all of them. When we get to the 6th one, we'll say, oh, great, we learned all 6 cases. Although it's not going to be so simple because since we have abbreviations, anyone who lives in Israel knows everything in Israel is abbreviations, and half the time you don't really know what all the abbreviations stand for. So likewise here, not everybody really knew what everything stood for. There was a Masoret, the Yal Kigam, the 6 cases. Some people think, or many people think, it's Lechi Ha'omed Me'elav, which is our case, is the Lamed. Rabbeinu Tam disagrees. He thinks that's not the Lamed, but Rashi and others think that this is the Lamed, and therefore it's a very famous case because we hold like Abaye, and you'll see from the structure of the Gemara why it seems clear that they wanted to hold like Abaye, because every single source they bring is going to be a support for Abaye and a rejection of Rava. In the end, we're going to answer most of them, but in the end, we're always going to be left with a question against Rava. So it makes sense in this case that they want to hold like Abaye. Abaye thinks this works, Rava thinks it doesn't. Now they're going to modify it and say, well, it depends on the case. If you didn't rely on this before, this sounds a lot like our muktzah when it has to be, did you designate it before Shabbat started? It's the same kind of idea here. If this is designated before Shabbat started as a lechi, that's when they have a machloket. But if nobody planned on this being a lechi, there was something standing in the doorway on the side. You put your post, let's say, on the other side or next to it. And then the post fell on Shabbat and it's already, it can't function as a post. Then can you rely on this item that was here before? According to the Gemara right now, everyone agrees that this doesn't work. Okay? Delo have lechi. Even Abaye thinks that's not a lechi. Has to have been designated at least before Shabbat. The question is just, right? The question becomes, if I decided that my tree that's standing right at the entrance to the mavoi, I want to function as my lechi, does that work or not? Okay, that's the debate. Now we're going to see why. Abaye amar havi lechi. Now here it's kind of funny. You never define anything by using the same words as the definition. So here it doesn't really explain it, but he says, why does it work? Because you relied on it since yesterday. Now that's sufficient, he says. Rava amar lo have lechi, kevandemi kaha lava date dahachi avide lo have lechi. Because you didn't really think about this from the beginning, right? You didn't make it for that purpose, since it's not even about thinking. This is, again, maybe the distinction between thinking and action. We don't care what you thought about it before Shabbat. It's a matter of, did you do something to turn this into your lechi? And no, this was a tree that was planted a long time ago, and maybe it was there before the lechi, before the mavoi walls even existed, who knows, right? And therefore, this doesn't work. So now they say, now we're going to try to, the first thing they do before we get further into this machloket, if you look at my chart at the top, you're going to see that there's actually a reason given in the to each opinion, but we're not yet there. Okay, what the Gemara is going to do first is to say, before we even go on, they're going to say, well, we imagine, we're assuming, kasal kadatach, that means olel datcha, meaning we think that what? Ki hechi de pligi belechi, pligi nami b'mechitza. That if they have this argument about a lechi that was there on its own, right, you didn't designate it to be a lechi, they would also have the same machloket about a mechitza, than an actual wall. Okay, but just like they argue about lechi al me'elav, they argue about mechitza homed me'eleh. And mechitza is relevant in all sorts of cases, not just in mavoi, but mechitza is relevant for, we're going to see, for a sukkah wall, let's say, you need to have a certain amount of walls, right? 2 big main walls and 1 smaller one, but you need to have walls. What constitutes a wall? Can it be something that existed before? Or does it need to be something that you designated specifically to be a wall? Right? So Rava, so now they're going to assume, just like Abai said, lechi al me'elav works as a lechi, it will work as a mechitza. And just like Rava says it doesn't work, Rava will say it doesn't work as a mechitza either. That's their assumption. They're going to knock this out in a few minutes. But right now, that's their working assumption, that it would be the same. So now they say, if that's the case, okay, and you can look at the second chart on the page, we're now going to bring 3 sources against Abaye. 3 sources supporting Abaye that show these sources, they're Tanaitic sources, which is always good if you have a Tanaitic source that's going to support Abaye and question Rava. In each case, it's going to be the same structure. We're going to say it must be in a case where you did it specifically for that, and that's why it works, meaning, right, it was designated for that from the beginning, even though it didn't really seem that way. Then they'll ask, well, then if it was designated that way, why do they even need to tell us this law? And then they'll explain why. What was the chidush? Okay, and they're going to do that in all the cases. So let's read until they get to 1/4 case where they're not going to be able to have an answer for Rava, and then they're going to reject the whole assumption that we just made, that the same machloket applies in both. Okay, we're going to basically, because we get stuck, we're going to say it must not be true that they argue about this. But right now we're going to assume they argue. Tashma, source number 1. If you make your sukkah, you build it right next to trees, and the trees create a wall for your sukkah, kshera. So what do you see here? Obviously, you didn't plant the tree for that purpose, although maybe you did. We're going to see. But right now, we assume the tree was there, and you just want to use it as your sukkah wall. This works, right? By the way, this is different. You can't do it for schach, because schach ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asoy. It can't be from something that was already there. So what's the case? Well, you must have planted the tree in order to be your sukkah wall. You knew you were going to put your sukkah there, so you planted your tree for that purpose. That's how Rava would explain it. Ihachi pshita. If you planted it specifically to be your wall, then of course it's going to work. What's the chidush here? So they say, no, there is a chidush. You might have thought, maybe even if you planted it to be a wall of a sukkah, maybe you can't use it because what might happen if you sit in the sukkah on Yom Tov, you might use the tree. Remember we said the whole problem with using the tree, or obviously also on Shabbat of Sukkot. So therefore you might have thought you can't use a sukkah wall that's a tree. Kamashman, you can. Comes to teach you that, no, it's okay. So we've explained this one according to Rava. Tashma, second source. Again, according to our assumption that Rava would argue also about mechitza, which like I said, we're going to reject. Tashma, hayasham ilan o gader o chitzat kanim. Nidon mishum diyomed. Okay, now we're moving to case number, you can look in source number, picture number 111. It's our classic case of what we call pasei biraot. This is when you have the be'er, the well, and you want to allow carrying within the space around the well. The well's in the public domain, so you make a kind of private domain around it. And here we allow, there's a special kula because of water, that you don't need a full wall, right? You can just put up a little thing in the corner. Now we're going to learn that they call it, we called it before pasei biraot, the pasim, right, which is the same term we use, boards, right, little boards that we used for the chatzer, for the courtyard. Now we're going to see that it's called the diomed. Diomed like duo, right, do is 2. So it's got 2 little beam posts that basically form an imaginary wall. But now they say, what if instead of a diomed, you had, what did you had? You had a tree or a fence or a chitzat kanim. You had little reeds that grew from the ground with some space in between them. Those nido mishum diomed. These all work as this imaginary, this type of pretend wall that we're going to make around this space. So now they say, again, what's the assumption? These obviously the tree was there. It sounds like the fence probably was there, and the reeds for sure they had grown. You didn't plant them for this purpose. So that seems to support Abaye against Rava. Again, they answer, Hachanami b'mayaskinam. What's the case? No, you planted them for that purpose. You put up the fence for that purpose. The tree you planted for that purpose. Everything was there for that purpose. So if so, what's it coming to teach us? Kamashmalan chitzat kinim kane pachot mishlosha tvachim. Okay, let's start from the end. Abaye asked Rabba the following question. If you put up reeds in the corner here, in this pasei biraot case, that are within 3 tvachim of each other, okay, meaning you can use the laws of Levud. What happens, how does Levud work? Levud works, now generally we have to have Amud merubah parutz. We're going to get back to this later. What's standing has to be more than what's not there, right? It has to be less breach than actual wall, right? And that's less breach. It has to be more wall than breach. In this case, if you have a few reeds with a space of less than 3 tvachim in between them, we assume the reeds are very thin, you're going to have more open space than closed space. But the way Levud works is Levud basically makes it, since these are all within 3 tvachim, you have them lined up within 3 tvachim of each other, we view it as if it's solid. Because we view it as if it's solid, it's no longer parutz merubah laomed. It's not breached more than it is standing. It's imaginary. We imagine as if it's solid. So theoretically, this should work. And it does work. And that's what the chiddush is. That's what it reads here when we said, it's to teach us that kaneh pachot mishlosha tvachim works. That even if they're spread out, if they're spread out, but they're less than 3 tvachim in between, we view this as if it's a solid wall and it works. But like Abaye had asked Rabba. Now, why did Abaye ask Rabba? Isn't it obvious? This is Levud. Levud always works. No, because Abaye's question was like this. It's an interesting question. What Abaye says, and again, you see his more stringent position in general, his more stringent leaning. He says, if we already made a huge leniency in the pasei biraot, because normally you have to have a solid wall, and in this case, or a more wall than open. In this case, remember, you have these little things in the corners, but you have this big space. We saw there was a machloket. Is it 13 1/3 amot? Is it 10 amot? But whatever it is, it's a huge space. You have much less standing in general. So he said, maybe Levud won't work in that case to make these reeds solid. Maybe we would say that once we already have one leniency, we can't be lenient in something else. So maybe Levud wouldn't work here the way it works in other places. But this comes to teach you it does work, okay? So therefore, we answer this question. There's still a chidush, even if you planted it specifically for that purpose, and therefore it works with Rava. Next case, Tashma. Ilan hamesach ala aretz. Let's say you have a tree, and now we're going to see the tree could be huge. And what happens is the branches grow out and then go down toward the ground. If the branches go down, lean toward the ground, if the branches reach down or the leaves reach down close within 3 handbreadths of the ground, mitaltalim tachtav, this creates a machitza. Again, what does it sound like? This, you probably didn't plant this just for this purpose. It sounds like it's support for Abaye, that if it's a machitza, that's omedet me'eleh, it works. So again, hachinami b'ma'askinan shenita'o mitchila lakach. Seems like you planted it in order, right? Let's say and we're going to learn who went under these trees. The guards who were guarding the fields wanted a place to protect themselves. So maybe they planted this tree. Obviously, it was going to take them years for it to grow big enough like this, but they planted it for the purpose of creating a shady space for them. And then it was planted with the intent for it to be machitza. But now the Gemara has a different question than the usual. If that's the case, you should be allowed to carry under this tree anywhere you want, not depending on size. And we're going to see that this is limited. Alama amar Rav Huna Rav Yoshua. Why did Rav Huna the son of Rabbi Yoshua say, "Ein metaltalim bo ela beit sa'atayim"? You can only carry if it's beit sa'atayim, which I think is a 5,000 square amma space, which is a big space, but it's limited to this amount. Okay, which is generally what we have a limit of a space when it's not meant for living purposes. We generally say it's like if there's a big space, we'll see this amount comes up in all sorts of cases. Anyway, you have up until Beit Sa'atayim. So why? if you planted this for the purposes of creating mechitzot, these are mechitzot you created, why should there be any limit on the size? Now, hard to imagine a tree would grow that big, but theoretically. So what do they answer? Mishum dehavi dira shetashmisha la'avir. V'chol dira shetashmisha la'avir ein metaltalim ba'ela beit sa'atayim. They now say, this is where this comes up, this beit sa'atayim, in a space that wasn't meant to be a living space. Okay, now this was a living space for the guards, but now we're going to define there's two types of living spaces. There's living spaces where you want to block out the elements, like get away from the sun, the wind, the rain. That's what this is for. But a house, yes, it has that purpose, but it's also meant for what's inside the house. It's not just to protect you from what's outside. It's also for all sorts of uses of inside the house. This space is not meant for anything inside. It's just to protect you from the outside. So because of that, it's not actually called like a regular living space, in which case we're going to limit it to beit sa'atayim, which means basically we're not going to, it's the amount of space, by the way, that you can plant sa'atayim of produce. Anyway, because of that, it's not a question. That's the chidush here, and it doesn't create a problem with that, the fact that we limit it. It doesn't mean anything. Tashma, last source. Last source. Up to source number 4. Now we're moving into what we call Eruv Tchumim. We're going to get to this later in the Masechet. What is Eruv Tchumim? On Shabbat, you can't walk more than 2,000 amot, 2,000 cubits outside your city, unless you decide that before Shabbat, I'm designating my space for Shabbat is somewhere else. You can do that either by staying there or by putting food down there. You have to have some sort of what we call koneh shvita, and here we're going to say Shavat. Okay, the word means Shabbat. He basically rested there when Shabbat came in. He said, this is my place for Shabbat. Now, if it's just out in the middle of nowhere and you're not in a city or a space or anything else, you get 4 amot, right? Because that's your space. A person's space is considered 4 cubits, right? Like if you stretch out your arms and stuff, you end up with a 4 cubit space plus another 2,000. If you do it in a space that's a Rishudei Yachid, let's say the Rishudei Yachid is 10 cubits by 10 cubits, just for example, then you get those 10 cubits, the whole Rishudei Yachid space, plus another 2,000 amot. So now the Gemara is quote a source, Shavat betel shu gavoa asara. Let's say you were on a mound, like a hill, that was 10 tfachim tall, vihu be'arba amot ad beit sa'atayim, and the size is from 4 amot to until beit sa'atayim. This is, again, we talked about, because it's a Rishudei Yachid that's not a house. Okay, let's say you have a gigantic house, so that will count as Rishudei Yachid even if it's more than beit sa'atayim. If it's not a house, then Rishudei Yachid kind of ends at beit sa'atayim. It can't go more than that if it's not meant for housing purposes. So if it's less than 4 amot, why don't they give a case of less than 4 amot? If it's less than 4 amot, well, then it doesn't really make a difference if you're in a space or not, because in any case, you get only 4 amot and then some. So this is saying from 4 amot till beit sa'atayim, b'chein b'neka shu amot kasara v'hu me'arba amot beit sa'atayim, or if it's a hole in the ground, like a naturally formed hole, that's, again, it's got all the criteria because it's 10 tefachim high of a Rishudei Yachid, and it's more than, right, that would have to be 4 by 4 tefachim. Okay, but in this case, they could talk about amot because less than 4 amot anyway, you only get 4 amot plus your 2,000. And the third case, kamak tzura v'shibolot mekifot ota. You have a field that you cut everything, but you left a rim on the outer edge. Okay, so that basically creates a wall. So all these are natural walls, basically. Okay, they weren't made by man. So mahalechet kula, you have the entire space. These count as walls. And then you get another 2,000 amot. Maybe you'd say, well, you put it there on purpose for that purpose. Well, the only case you could say that would work is in the case where you had the field. And maybe you planted the entire field so that you could harvest the middle, leave the edges on the outside to create your own mechitza. But those are naturally those are natural formations. They're not things that you specifically planted, or you can't plant a neka in the ground, and you can't plant. You could build a mound, I guess, but we're talking about a natural mound. Therefore, we basically say this doesn't work at all with Rava, because if we say, again, this is all based on, you have to remember where we started. Rava and Abaye have a machloket lechi al me'elav. We assume the machloket applies also for machitza. Now we say it can't possibly apply for machitza because then Rava wouldn't agree with this source. And therefore, we basically reject what we said. And therefore, we say, Ela b'mechitzot kule ama, we're on the fifth wide line, kule ama lo pligi dahavya mechitza. Everyone agrees that a mechitza, that's omedet me'elav, that you didn't plan for those purposes, is a mechitza anyway. If it's a real wall, that works. Ki pligi belechi. But the machloket is about lechi, and one can understand why it would be a difference. A mechitza is an actual mechitza. It actually makes a wall. But when it comes to a lechi, it's just something that's more symbolic. So ki pligi belechi. Abaye, now we're going to say, so what's the machloket? And now it goes back, I entered this into the first chart, even though it comes up later in the daf. Abaye l'ta'ameh, Abaye goes according to his approach. Now, there's a debate about this word, if this is really true or not. If you say l'ta'ameh, it means it's somewhere else we have to know that Abaye held this, which there's sort of an indicator, but it's not so clear. Some people don't have this word, and they say, no, it's here that we have it, that Abaye says, it's mishum, we're going to see, it's mishum mechitza. Okay, it's not that he goes the way he says somewhere else, it's that this is where we learn it. So two ways to read this. Abaye l'ta'ameh da'amar lechi mishum mechitza, u'mechitza suyam me'ela havya mechitza. We just proved that a mechitza that was there from before and functions as a mechitza. If lechi works as a mechitza, okay, then we can say, this works as a mechitza, and it has all the laws of a mechitza. Mechitza that was there anyway can function. This also can function. And Rava l'ta'ameh amar lechi mishum hekel. Rava says it's symbolic. It's just so you notice there's something noticeable. If that's the case, well then it's only going to be noticeable if you put it there, right? If it was there anyway, you're not going to notice it, right? This is a good classic example of this is like there's always things in your house that are broken, right? And you don't really notice they're broken, but other people come into your house and they notice. And I remember once we rented at our house and all of a sudden I had to explain, oh yeah, by the way, when you open the door, be careful because this might happen or that, right? You don't even notice these things until someone else comes in. So if it's something, if you put it in there specifically, then it will be something noticeable. If it's something that's always there, the tree that's always right next to the mavoi, everyone's just used to seeing that tree. They're not going to even pay attention to it. Below, lo havya heker. So then it won't be a heker. Now, by the way, just to go back to where did Abaye say it's mishum mechitza, it's always good to do this because it reviews things we saw before. On Daf Hey, there was a machloket between Abaye and Rav Yosef, who's actually at the bottom of Dalet Amud Bet. Remember the case where the korah was higher than 20 amot, and you wanted to raise the floor in order they would be less than 20 amot. And the debate was, does it have to be a tefach in width, or does it have to be, according to Abaye, 4 tefachim in width at the bottom? Okay, the width of the bottom piece that you're raising has to be 4 tefachim. There were 3 explanations given there as to what the machloket was. One of the explanations was that Abaye holds it's mishum mechitza, a korah is because of mechitza, even though if you remember, we just saw that most people think korah is heker and lechi is mechitza, okay? But here you see it's not so clear cut. And he says, since it's mishum mechitza, it has to land on something of significance. A mechitza has to be, usually it's rooted in the ground. So in this case, it can't just be rooted on a beam that's 1 tefach wide. It would have to be on top of 4 tefachim. And there it said that Abaye would say mishum mechitza. Now, the problem is it's not so clear that Abaye actually says it because it was only one of 3 suggestions. Then the Gemara said, maybe they all think it's heker, and the machloket has to do with, that you have to line it up with the top one, just like the top one is the tefach, or you don't have to line it up, and that's why Abaye says 4. Anyway, it's a debate there. So maybe that's what this is referring to when it says Abaye goes according to his approach, that lechi is mishum mechitza. Okay, tashma. So now, we now at this point, we have the machloket. We learned it's only for lechi, not for mechitza. Now we assume the debate between them has to do with, do we view lechi as a mechitza or do we view lechi as a heker? And that would explain the reason why they debate this topic. Now we're going to bring, just like we did before, a number of sources that support Abaye and go against Rava, but not about mechitza, but about lechi. Okay, so tashma. Avnei gader hayatzot min gader. So we're back to mavoi cases, not mechitza cases. So now you have a wall. This is picture number 112. You have a wall where jutting out of your wall of your mavoi are stones. Stones are jutting out from the side of the wall. Okay, it's picture 112. So what happens in this case? They're yotzot min hagader muvdalot zo mizo pachot mishlosha. If they're less than 3 height in between each of these stones, Ein sarich lechi acher. This can function as your lechi because again, din levud, it's as if it's solid, and this works. Shlosha sarich lechi acher. But if it's 3 in between them, then already you need a different lechi. That's not going to work because it's not really a post because it's not straight down. So again, this seems to support Abaye, the first part of it, that if they're within 3 tvachim of each other, this will work as a lechi, even though it's just part of the wall and you didn't build it to be a lechi. So again, what are they going to assume? Hachanami, to explain it like Rava, shebina'am mitchila lekach. So then they say, right, it was built for that purpose. Ihachi pshita, well then obviously this should work. Why? What are they telling you? Ma'u detema lemesar binyana hu da'avida kamashmalan. You might have thought that it was built this way for Lego formation. Like maybe you'll later want to fill in a different wall and it'll kind of fit together. And maybe that's why you did it. So because of that, this is actually a very strange answer because what they suggested was maybe you built it for the purpose of a lechi. And then they come and say, well, no, maybe people will think that you built it for the purposes of, like a Lego type wall where it kind of fits into each other. And therefore they won't think it's a lechi. It's not exactly marit ayin, but it's almost like marit ayin. Like even though you built it for that purpose, people might think you built it and that you built it that way on purpose. But maybe people will think it wasn't really built to be your lechi, though maybe it was built for some other reason like that. Tashma, another source. Detani Rabbi Chia. Kotel shetzido achad kanus mechaviro. This actually we learned before. It's where the wall juts in and then goes back out when you're inside the mavoi. So you see the lechi from within, but you don't see it from without. Or it's outside the mavoi and it goes in a little. And then you see it from the outside, it's noticeable, but not from the inside. So this was the shaveh, right? Bein shenir'emi bachutz v'shaveh mi b'fnim, whether it's viewed from the outside, but flush on the inside, or bein shenir'emi b'fnim v'shaveh mi bachutz, or the reverse, nido mishum lechi. So now this just talks about a wall that juts in at different places. Again, it sounds like it was part of your wall and you didn't do it on purpose, and yet it counts as a lechi, seems to go against Rava. So hachanami, again, they say, same answer. Shasa mitchila lekach. This daf is kind of easy because it just keeps repeating the same structure over and over. So Rava will say, you built the wall that way on purpose to be your lechi. So ihachi my kamash malham. Well, if that's the case, then there's nothing new here. Ha-kamash malan nir'emi bachutz v'shaveh b'fnim nidom mishum lechi. No, it's a big machloket. Does it work? If you only view it from the outside and you can't see it from the inside, does that work? Remember, we saw there was a whole big debate about it. This source was coming to teach you specifically that it does work, and that's why you needed it. It is a big chidush, and that's why you need it, even if you specifically did the wall in that way. Okay. That was all our Tanaitic sources. So we brought 2 Tanaitic sources to support Abaye against Rava. Both we explained that we can explain Rava. Now we bring a story that happened with Rav. So we're already moving away from the Tanaitic sources. We're now into the first, the early Amoraim, Rav, and we're going to see a story. So here's our story. Dear Rav, by the way, I want you to notice here, this is a good example. Tashma introduces this. Tashma literally means bo ulamad, come and learn. So it means we're going to bring something from the outside. Here's a good example where the Tashma functions. First, it was an intro to Tanaitic sources, and now it's an intro to Amoraitic sources. And therefore, it doesn't necessarily tell you like the word etive or meitive, which tell you we're about to quote a Tanaitic source. This doesn't tell you anything. It just means we're quoting some other sources I told you the other day. So now here comes our story. Rav Havayativ Ba'ahu Mavoah. He was sitting in a mavoi, in an alley. Havayativ Rav Huna Kameh. Rav Huna appears before him, comes before him. Amrle L'Shameh. Okay, it's just important to know that Rav Huna is there because soon he's going to pipe in. But right now we're dealing with Rav and his shamash. His attendant comes and says, and Rav says to him, Zil Aiteli Kuza Demaya. Please go bring me a jug of water. Ada. Now in the meantime, he goes out of the mavoi to bring the jug of water. He goes and he wants to bring it in, or I guess he's in the mavoi, and he goes to bring it to him. Nafel lache. In the meantime, the lechi falls. Now the lechi falls, he can no longer carry within the mavoi. So now he's got this problem. He asks the shamash to go bring it to him. He sees the lechi fell. So what does he do? Now he can't scream. He's not going to hear him. So he starts motioning to him. Stop, don't move. Don't bring it to me. Kama duchte, the shamash stands and doesn't move. He understood him. Amarle Rav Huna. Now Rav Huna pipes in and says, Lo savar mar lismocha dikla. What? There's a tree right here in the beginning of the mavoi. Can't we use that? Amar damit now, and then that would be a lechi haomei me'elav. So what does he say? Dame haimer abanan kimandalo parsha inashe shmata. big insult. He says, you seem to be like someone who's really not learned so much, or you certainly didn't learn this halacha. Okay? What, did we rely on this from yesterday? Now, what do you learn from this? Tama de lo samchina. And remember we said, if you didn't do it from yesterday, everyone agrees it's no good. But it sounds like hasamchina, and if he had relied on it from yesterday, then have lechi, and that would prove Abaye there was a lechi hamei me'elav. Again, not from what he said, but from what he didn't say, right? From what he inferred. So now, lema Abaye v'Rava b'delo samchina ale plige. So to answer this question, they say maybe Abaye and Rava both agree in the case of lo samchina ale me'etmol that it wouldn't work, and maybe Abaye is only talking about on Shabbat. So they say hasamchina ale have lechi, right? But if they have relied on it from yesterday, maybe everyone would agree it's a lechi, and the debate is only if it happened on Shabbat, and then Abaye would say it works, and Rava says it doesn't. That would go against what we said earlier, but maybe that would resolve this source according to Rava. So they say, lo salkadata, can't be, and here they end with a very interesting thing. Dahu barka, dahava bar bechavu, dahavu plige be'Abaye v'Rava, kule shnayu. There was a case of the house of Bar Chamu where he had a pole that was holding up his balcony, and the pole apparently also functioned as a lechi in a mavoi. In other words, it was also standing right in front of an alley, the entrance to the alley. And Rav and Abaye constantly, all the years of their lives, I assume this is a bit of an exaggeration, but they argued about this particular mavoi, does it work or not, because it's a lechi al me'elav. Now, if you say that samchina ale me'etmol, even Rav would agree, then obviously you could have said, before Shabbat, just decide that we're going to count this and it would be fine. So the fact that they disagreed about this their whole lives basically shows that Rava doesn't think that, and therefore we're back to square one, and we're back to that this source goes against Rava and its contradiction. Okay, moving forward to the next Mishnah. Bakol, and now we have a very strange Mishnah, and it's about using animals for various things. Okay, can you use an animal as a lechi? Okay, if you look at picture number 113, here's I think it's a horse. There's a horse standing in the entranceway of the mavoi on the side. Can that function as a lechi? There's a few issues with animals. Number one is they move. That's probably the biggest problem. Rashi talks about the fact that they live their their life is based on their ruach hayim, basically, and that could change, right? They could die. Their body could shrink a little, like let's say it's 10 tefachim tall and then all of a sudden they shrink, or, things change. It's a changeable item, and therefore it's technically seemingly problematic, but we're going to see that not everybody agrees with that. You can make a lechi according to Tanakama with an animal. Rabbi Meir oser. Rabbi Meir says, no, you can't. Umitame mishum golel. Generally, animals are not susceptible to impurity until they become an avela, if they die. Okay, or a sheretz, for example, the Shmona Shretzim are only when they die. But, so animals are not tameh, they don't carry tumah, only humans can have tumah while they're still alive. However, what they say here is, in a case where the animal functions as a cover for the grave, which is either the cover itself of the coffin, or the cover for the burial cave, then some people say that, okay, Tanakama says, it is tameh in that case because it's so close to the tumah, I guess, and it's functioning. It's providing a function for the mate. So because of that, it becomes tameh. For Rabbi Meir Mitaher, he says, no, it's alive. It doesn't have tumah at all. The last one, Rabbi Meir doesn't talk about this, but someone else disagrees with Tanakama, which is a very strange one. Kotvina lav gitei nashim. You could write a get a man could write a get for his wife on an animal. Now, it's not so crazy. They wrote on parchment. Parchment came from animals. But here we're talking about on a live animal. You think about people who write on their hands and things like that. You could write the get, give the animal to your wife, and she's divorced. The Rabbi Yossi Aglili posel. He says no can do. And we're going to get into a bunch of issues and drashot about what exactly you need when you give a get. And this is a very interesting topic. It's also very interesting conceptually. Again, we won't have so much time to go into it, but I'll kind of give you some thoughts to take you with, and you can go with it where you want after class. Tanya, Rabbi Meir Homer. Kol davar sheyesh b'ruach hayim eino sinoto. Now he's going to give a list, not just for this, but for other things. Lo dofen l'sukkah. It can't be a wall of a sukkah. Lo lechi lemavoy, lo pasim lebiraot. You can't put it up as one of those 4 posts in the be'er case, in the well case. Below golel lekever. Okay, you can't use it for any of these things. Mishum Rabbi Yossi Aglili amru. Now they said in the name of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, not only that, but also af ein kotvin alav gitei nashim. right? You have to wonder about animal rights, and is this fair to use an animal for these things? And, it's also another direction to go with this. So now they want to know what's the reason for Rabbi Yossi Aglili. And for this is one of those ping-pong drashot, where Rabbi Yossi is going to learn it from this. What does the other side do with that pasuk? And we're going to go back and forth because each one they're going to say, what does he do with his pasuk? So I charted it out for you about what they learn from each word in the pasuk. The verse reads like this: Ki kach ish isha u'ba'ala, when a man takes a wife and consummates the marriage, and then she doesn't find favor in his eyes. A whole difficult pasuk in and of itself. We'll deal with this much later on. Ki yimtza ba'ervat davar, if he finds in her some inappropriate behavior. V'katav la sefer kritut, based on this is a whole debate about can you divorce your wife for any reason, or does it have to be, there's a big machloka bet Shammai bet Hillel about it. We'll get to that. If I remember correctly, it's what ends Masechet Gitin or Kiddushin, I forget, one of them ends with this whole thing, with that famous machloket. V'katav la sefer kritut, and then he gives her this bill of divorce, you could call it. It's a book of separation. Okay, that's what it says. V'natan biyadav shachami beito, and he puts it in her hand and he sends her off. What's going to really interest us is these words. He writes for her a sefer kritut. So the whole thing is, what does it have to be written on? So my time at Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who says you can't write on an animal, Titania sefer. Okay, here's a braita, and it starts with the word sefer, a book. Ainli ala sefer. It sounds like it has to be a book, okay, which I guess for them meant a piece of parchment, right? Minayin l'rabot kol davar. How do you know you can write it on anything? Talmud lomar v'katav la. The main thing is he has to write it. Doesn't matter as much what he writes it on. He has to write it, which sounds like it includes everything. Now, it can't be because Rabbi Yossi Aglili limits it. So now we're going to say, So v'katav la sounds like mikol. Im ke matam lomar sefer. So they should have just said v'katav la kritut. It didn't need to say sefer. So what do you learn from the fact that it says sefer? Lomar lecha ma sefer davar. It has to be like a book. Ma sefer davar she'ein bo ruach hayim. Right? It's written on something that has no life in it. Ve'eno ochel, and it's not food. Af kol davar she'ein bo ruach hayim ve'eno ochel. So it has to be written on something that doesn't have life in it and isn't food, which kind of sounds like he wants something permanent in nature. This is where we get to the conceptual idea here. He seems to want something permanent that separates between the two of them. The Rabbanan, who say you can write on an animal, what do they do with this? Miktiv b'sefer. It doesn't say in a book. It says sefer ktiv. It just says write a book of separation. Now, the root safal in Hebrew comes from sipur, to tell a story. Lisfirut varim ba'al mahuda'ata. This is fascinating. What he's saying is the get is really to tell a story. It's to tell that we're separating. It's to say we're no longer going to be together, but it's not about the permanence of it, that it lasts forever. It's about the moment of the divorce and the discussion, what it's saying. It's telling a story. That's what's important. So now they're going to go back to what do the rabbis do? And he said has to be written on anything, right? So what do they do with that? Here's another fascinating line. You might have thought you could divorce with money. What does it mean, divorce with money? That he would pay her out, basically. He would give her money and say, with this money, you're divorced. Why would you think this? Well, because the way she goes into the marriage should be the way she goes out of the marriage. There's three ways a woman can get married. Kesef, shtar, or bi'ah. Okay, we'll deal right now with the kesef and we'll get to all the others later. But you can betroth a woman with money. That's what we do, actually. Something worth money, right? A ring has value to it. So just like you get married, you might have thought, and this is fascinating because what does this mean? The way you get married is not the same as the way you get divorced. You need something different. It's not like it's just undoing exactly in the same way that it was created. And this, by the way, shows that it's not all about when the man betroths his wife with money, and the Mishnah calls it Hayishan Yeknet, she's acquired. It's not really a payment, because if it were a payment, right, like he's kind of acquires her with money, then she would have to give back the money to get undivorced. And that's not even what they're suggesting at all. It would be that the money is a formal way of saying, I'm doing something serious. I'm putting money down, and that means that I'm serious about this. So you would think that just like it worked for marriage, it would work for divorce. And you could say, I'm serious about divorcing you. I'm putting money down, and this is an indicator that we're getting divorced. But no, it's not, because divorce is not the same. By the way, it's a little similar. We talked about this. Kiddush and Havdalah is the way you bring in Shabbat, the same way you bring out Shabbat, right? Are they parallel? They're not exactly parallel, right? So it's the way you come out of something is not always the way you go into something. It's an interesting conceptual framework. So you can think about that. In any case, He learns that from the word v'katavla, that you need ktiva, and it's not enough something, by money. So now the Gemara says, so Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Hai Sfara Menale, where does he learn b'ktiva mitgareshet and not with money? He learns it nafkalemi sefer kritut. The fact that it says a book of separation teaches you sefer korta ve'ein davar acher korta. He connects those two words and says, oh look, sefer teaches you it has to be like a book, but sefer kritut teaches you it has to be something, a book has to separate between you and not money. V'Rabbanan, Hai sefer kritut. So what do the rabbis do with that? Because they learned it from V'katavla, not from here. It has to be something, they say, that splits between them in a very clear manner. So what does that mean? To exclude the following case, as it says in a Braita, if he says this is going to be your get under the condition that you don't ever drink wine. So that means her divorce might never be, she might drink wine one day in 50 years and then they'll end up not being divorced. Or you'll never go to your father's house. That doesn't work. But if he says for 30 days you won't drink wine, then this get will be a get. That works because there's a definitive time period or a moment where they will be divorced. Even though it's not now, it will be. Now, by the way, it could even be 10 years. As long as it's some sort of cutoff point, it works. That's what he learned from Kritut. It has to separate them definitively. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Nafkale, where does he learn this from? Karet Kritut. The fact that it didn't say Sefer Karet, it said Sefer Kritut, you can learn two things from that word. And the Rabbanam, why don't they learn it from there? Karet Kritut lo darshe. They don't make that kind of a drasha. Okay, next Mishnah. So like I said, there's fascinating things there. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into them, but it's a whole interesting thing about conceptually thinking about the framework of marriage, divorce, and how it works, etc. And about animals in general. Can you use animals, not use animals? That's a whole, in and of itself, a whole nother topic. Mishnah. We now have a caravan of people that camped out in a big open valley, and they took what they had, which was their kelim of the utensils that they used for the animals, and they put up a wall with it. They can carry within the space. They have to, at least, the kelim have to be 10 tvachim tall. And you can't have open spaces that are bigger than the built spaces, right? We've learned this before. That's how you have a mechitza. It has to be more solid wall than open wall. Kol pirtzashi ke'eser amot. If you have an opening that's 10 amot, muteret mipnei shi kepetach. Yeter mikan asur. But even within that, okay, you need to still have, if you have a pirtza of 10, you can say that's an opening, as long as it's in a wall that's 20 plus. But if it's not 20 plus, or maybe 20, that's going to be the whole debate, then even a 10 is not going to work, okay? But in addition, even if you have, let's say, 25 wall and a 12 and a half opening, that's also going to be a problem. Even though if you have, let's say, 12 in 20, 12 is too big to be called an opening, okay? It has to be a breach. So that's also not going to work. So now the Gemara starts off with a big machloket. It's the exact same framework as we had earlier in the daf. Itmar parutz ke'omeh. What if it's exactly 50-50? Then does that work or not? So Rav Papa Amar Mutal, that's fine. Rav Huna B'Reid Rav Yeshua Amar Asur. Rav Papa Amar Mutal, and he doesn't really explain why, but he says it's about looking at half full or half empty. Hachi Admare Rachmana L'Moshe. This is kind of figuratively, the Ravid says this isn't really true. It's certainly not halacha l'Moshe Misinai, but he says it's like God told Moshe, Lo tifrol tzruba. Don't let most of it be open, which means if it's equal, it's fine. Rav Huna B'Reid Rav Yeshua Amar Asur Hachi Admare Rachmana L'Moshe Gdor Ruba. Make sure most of it is closed in. So if it's half-half, that's not going to work. So again, it's a matter of how you look at it. Half full, half empty. So now we're going to have the exact same structure as before with Rav and Abaye. Here we're going to start bringing sources that seem to prove Rav Papa that it's allowed against Rav Huna, Rav Yoshua. So Tnan, first we're going to quote our Mishnah, V'lo yihu pirtzot yiterot al habinyan. You can't have the openings more than the built space. So that sounds like ha kebinyan mutal. If it were equal, it would be allowed. So they say, lo tema ha kebinyan mutal, ela ema, no, read it like im binyan yeter ala pirtza mutal. No, read it as if what's built is more than what's open, then it's allowed. So they say, aval kebinyan mai asul. Well, if they really wanted to say that, then they should have said that. Ihachi litnei lo yuhu pirtzot kibinyan. The fact that they don't say that actually is cautious. So this really does seem to support Rav Papa. Last source for today, Tashma, hamekares sukato b'shipudim o ba'arukot hamita. If you have on your sukkah roof, you have metal poles or wooden parts from your bed. Okay, what's the issue here? These are all non-kosher schach because they're susceptible to impurity. You could use wood as long as it's unfinished. If it's finished and it was used for something, then already it's a utensil, and then it's susceptible to impurity. Anything susceptible to impurity can't be used as schach. So you have picture number 14. You have these wooden boards that are from your bed, and they're basically covering half your sukkah. Okay, so your sukkah thing. If you have the exact same space in between where you could put the green stuff as the kosher schach, then it's kasher, it works. So now it sounds like exactly Rav Papa. Equal is fine because look here, equal works. So they say, no, it means that you can fit in an equal amount, but to fit in exactly, think about when you put books on a bookshelf. If it exactly fits, it's really hard to get in. So it must be it's a little bit wider in order to get your schach in. So then they say, no, you really could fit them in exactly, and maybe it really means exact. So two answers are given. Amravami b'ma'adif. It's where they go a little bit over into the other space. Okay, maybe they sit perched on the other one. Or im Rava Amar im hayunitunim erev notno shti. Shti notno erev. This is picture number 115. If your beams were going in one way, the schach was going in the other direction. Now, if the schach is going into in the other direction, it obviously has nothing to be supported by, right? The other way, they were all going the same direction. It would be supported by the walls on either side. Here, they're going in the other direction. They use the weaving terminology to show different directions, and then the only thing it would be supported on would be by the wall, by the non-kosher schach, which means they would have to jut out somewhat over there, and then you would end up with more kosher schach than non-kosher schach. So they basically come and explain the source that it could be like Rav Huna, even though the pshat seems to be much more like Rav Papa. We're going to continue with this tomorrow into tomorrow's daf, and with that, we'll end for today. Have a good day, everybody.